Hey guys, and welcome back to Something Wicked. My name is Jacqueline, and today's case may forever change the way you feel about hospitals. As a heads up, if you already have a fear of hospitals, you do not want to watch this case. And if you don't have a fear of hospitals, you very well may when this video is over. Sorry in advance. Now I just need to get a few details out before we get started. The majority of my research for this case is from the book The Good Nurse by Charles Graeber, an award-winning journalist and author, and all quotes I refer to in my video are quotes taken from this book. Graeber spent countless hours in conversation with Charles Cullen at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton and researched his book for 6 years. Some of the names of the people involved have been changed to keep their identity a secret. Charles Cullen has confirmed to have killed 29 people over the course of his 16-year nursing career, but evidence suggests he killed as many as 40. In fact, some individuals heavily involved in the case believed that the numbers could be in the hundreds. I would like to state vehemently that each and every victim is as important as the other. However, I can only report on a select number, and some cases have more information to report. There was no other deciding factor in my decision to report one victim over another, and my heart goes out to each and every family member who lost a loved one at the hands of Charles Cullen. Now let's dive into the case of the Angel of Death, Charles Cullen. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, 1991, St. Barnabas Critical Care Unit admitted a patient named Anna Byers. She was scheduled for surgery to have a catheter placed in her heart. Nurses placed Anna on an IV drip of heparin, an anticoagulant used to thin the blood, preventing any clots that can bring about heart attacks or strokes, but also preventing the ceasing of blood flow after surgery. Shortly after this was administered to Anna, she began to feel nauseous. She started shaking, was confused, and broke out in a cold sweat. When tests were run, it showed that Anna had insulin levels that were, quote, off the charts. She was told to drink orange juice to normalize her blood sugar, but it didn't work. So nurses gave Anna an IV drip of dextrose, or sugar, straight into her bloodstream, and although it prevented Anna from dying, the insulin in her blood was still so high, and she crashed again. She remained in this state for the next 24 hours, and although likely not able to have the surgery the following morning, her nurses took her off the heparin drip just in case. The next day, however, now off the heparin drip, Anna was feeling better and was approved for surgery. Post-surgery, Anna appeared to be healing nicely. Her blood sugar stabilized and her surgical wounds were clotting appropriately, so she was put back on the heparin IV drip. But again, shortly after the drip was administered, Anna began to crash. Nurses tried regulating her blood with the sugar water as they did previous, but by 11 p.m. that evening, Anna's blood sugar levels were so low that they couldn't even get a reading, and her brain was being starved. She was very close to death, but when Anna was unhooked from her IV lines and rushed to intensive care, she again started to feel better, and quickly. Fred Belf, a patient down the hall to Anna in the same hospital, was also on the heparin drip. It only took a few hours after getting the drip for Fred to start vomiting onto his chest, so the nurses administered dextrose just as they had with Anna. The dextrose was administered simultaneously with the heparin, and the two fought it out for the next full day. The nurses were baffled, but soon a connection was made between the heparin that Anna and Fred had been given and its side effects, so the heparin bags were promptly sent for examination. Sure enough, something was wrong, and the bags tested positive for high levels of insulin when they should have only tested for saline and heparin. When the bags were inspected on a microscopic level, tiny needle pricks were found on the edges of the bags. This was extremely abnormal and looked to be intentional. Was someone going around poisoning IV bags at the hospital? In fact, just 3 days prior, on February 11th, nurse Pam Allen had also discovered suspicious-looking heparin and saline IV bags and brought them to the risk manager, Karen Seiden, for inspection. The port on the bag looked to have been used, but the bag itself was still full of liquid. When these bags were tested, they also contained deadly high levels of insulin, and suspicion arose in the hospital. Was someone trying to kill patients on purpose? Charlie was born on February 22nd, 1960, as a result of an unplanned pregnancy to his Irish Catholic parents, Florence and Edmund Cullen, the latter of which would pass away just 7 months later. He was the youngest of 8 children, and his other siblings were already well into early adulthood when he was born. His father, Edmund, was a bus driver and age 56 when Charlie was born. He died on September 17th, 1960. Charlie's mother, Florence Cullen, moved to the U.S. from England shortly after the Second World War. Charlie grew up in a row house on Kling Street in West Orange, New Jersey, and had, as he would describe it, a miserable childhood in a very religious Catholic family. His mother was a seamstress, and even with the assistance of church charities, was barely able to provide for the 8 children. The family also received disability checks from the late Edmund's sister, as she had a contorted leg and was generous enough to help financially when she could. Growing up, his house was always a hub for his addict brothers to do drugs in, as well as his sisters persistently needing temporary room and board for their slew of pregnancies. Sketchy acquaintances would accompany them both. Charlie's mother was his only saving grace, and he couldn't get enough of her love and attention, though sadly, her love would be stretched thin. Charlie was depressed even at a young age. He would skip classes at his Catholic school, often to stay home with his mother, and would refuse social outings. He said at school he felt, quote, incompetent and humiliated. In the world, he was disconnected and alone. In fact, throughout his life, Charlie would make many attempts at suicide, the first of which took place at the age of 9. Charlie stole a chemistry set from the church charity box and combined all the ingredients together and downed them with a glass of milk. However, the chemistry set was amateur, and Charlie just became very sick as a consequence. Charlie's mother would shelter young Charlie as best she could from the world and the skeevy instances taking place in their own home with his siblings. He was bullied over and over again by his sister's boyfriends, while his brothers were upstairs dealing drugs to strangers. When Charlie was 17, his mother was killed in a car accident during his final year of high school. He was crushed and devastated. His second suicide attempt took place shortly after this. Charlie had been at home the afternoon of December 6th, 1977, faking illness to get out of school, when the landline rang. His mother and sister had been out driving when his sister, who was behind the wheel, suffered an epileptic seizure. He needed to come to the hospital. When Charlie got to the hospital, he learned that the car accident had been a head-on collision. His mother was already dead, and her body had been taken away to be cremated. Charlie was, quote, angry and beyond consultation, believing that the mountainside hospital that had treated his mother had lied to him. He wouldn't find out until sometime later that his mother's body was in fact still in the hospital when he had arrived, and it was a bit of a miscommunication. At this time, however, Charlie was furious. The incident bred contempt and mistrust for hospitals in general, and he believed lying was a commonality amongst the staff. Although it is not stated how he attempted his second suicide, he did end up hospitalized because of it, and he was referred to his first psychiatrist. But Charlie's lips were sealed. He refused to talk and would be sent home again shortly after to the empty house where he had once lived with his mother. After returning home to mourn, things remained awful in the household. Charlie didn't go back to school. Weird strangers continued to keep coming around the house at all hours of the day and night, and the house was missing its maternal warmth. When Charlie turned 18, he completed his GED and enlisted in the Navy in April 1978. He completed 8 weeks of basic training at the Great Lakes, Illinois training facility, 7 months at the Naval Guided Missile School in Virginia Beach, and 3 months of submarine school in Groton, Connecticut. He wanted to be seen in a certain light, to have an identity and wear a crisp white uniform rather than consistent hand-me-downs that had been stained from years of previous wear from his siblings. He believed the Navy to be the safest division in the military, yet joining would still label him brave and heroic. As a child, Charlie had dreamt of a valiant death, dying a hero in battle, or defending his country as a policeman or as an important political figure. He didn't necessarily want to die, but he knew that joining the army meant he could die, connecting him to his childhood dreams of martyrdom. He became an electronics technician and was stationed on the USS Woodrow Wilson to service their 16 Polaris nuclear missiles. But Charlie would soon discover that this was not the career path for him. He didn't like taking orders, working on electronics, and being exiled for months on end, cooped up in a small cylinder in the middle of the ocean. Charlie Fishbelly, as his seamates would call him, tried to cancel his 6-year contract with the Navy but was unsuccessful, and his following resentment and insubordination resulted only in his demotion and reduced pay. In fact, many disciplinary hearings took place after Charlie refused to urinate in the presence of another sailor during mandatory drug testing. He found exposing himself in front of any audience to urinate, or for any reason, demeaning, and this would be a lifelong issue for him. In a reported but unverified incident later, Charlie was apparently witnessed by a superior officer standing at the nuclear missile launch panel, fully clad in green surgical mask and gown that he had taken from the medical supply closet. I find this particularly creepy. I mean, what was he planning to do? Take out the nuclear missile's appendix? Charlie would later claim that although this story is very entertaining, it is untrue. In his final year at the Navy, he was demoted to the point of having to work on land cleaning latrines. Charlie told his Navy psychiatrist that he was anxious about being dishonorably discharged and that he was suicidal because he didn't want to go home a failure. So Charlie turned to medication that he could always count on: booze. Charlie's alcoholism reached such a degree that he even resorted to drinking Listerine and cleaning fluid to numb the pain when traditional alcohol wasn't available. He was even hospitalized on January 13th, 1984, after chugging a bottle of cleaner and reporting it to sickbay saying, quote, "I drank some poison, I don't feel well." This would be his third suicide attempt since enlisting in the Navy. But all these attempts were only cries for help and attention, as Charlie never fully intended to die. Perhaps because he had also been raised Catholic and taught that suicide was a sin. His older brother James Cullen died of a drug overdose at 36 years of age. It's suspected to be a suicide, and Charlie didn't want to go into purgatory along with him. Charlie was hospitalized and committed to Charleston Naval Hospital's psychiatry ward. Charlie loved the attention he got from caretakers, saying, quote, "Nobody loves you the way they do when you're dying." Charlie was given a medical discharge from the Navy in 1984. Right after his time at the Navy, when Charlie was 24 years old, he decided to pursue a career in nursing, and in that same year enrolled at the Mountainside Hospital School of Nursing in Montclair, New Jersey. He was the only male student out of a class of 87 students. Due to his upbringing, he enjoyed female companionship. He also liked the ease of a uniform, and the medical subject matter intrigued him. He did well in this course. He was smart, well-liked, and actually became elected president of his nursing class. This was the validation he had been looking for, and he loved the attention. To pay for his nursing degree, Charlie worked a series of garbage jobs, predominantly in fast food. His military background permeated well into shift work, and he was no stranger to wearing a uniform or getting dirty. He worked for Dunkin' Donuts, Caldor, and Roy Rogers, and it was at the latter he would meet his wife, Adrienne Baum. Adrienne was a new college graduate with a business degree and worked alongside Charlie at Roy Rogers. She had a boyfriend at the time she met Charlie, but he liked her right away nonetheless. Adrienne was eventually transferred to a different location, so Charlie quit and worked full-time at the Caldor that neighbored the Roy Rogers, and he still ate his lunches there, just in case she came back. Adrian was transferred back about a month later, but this time without her boyfriend, and Charlie seized the opportunity to win her over. He showered her with gifts, flowers, candy, presents. If Adrian had mentioned she liked something, Charlie would surprise her with it. From Adrian's perspective, Charlie was a hard worker working 3 jobs, president of his nursing school class, and he would have a steady, modest income in the future. Not to mention, he adored her. The two dated and became extremely close, extremely fast. And only after 6 months of being a couple, the two were engaged. As soon as Charlie graduated from nursing school when he was 29 years old, they promptly got married and honeymooned in Niagara Falls. But their honeymoon was cut 1 day short so that Charlie could start his new job at St. Barnabas Medical Center in the burn unit. Married life started out blissful and optimistic for the newlyweds. They bought a small fixer-upper in the suburbs of Phillipsburg, Pennsylvania, but they didn't mind. They had got it for a great price. Adrian had landed a job in her field as a computer programmer and was making a decent wage, coupled with Charlie's nursing income. But their schedules were completely opposite. Charlie worked most nights and Adrian worked days, and soon loneliness crept in. Charlie was the kind of man that really wore his demons on his sleeve and used self-deprecating humor to lighten the load of his personal problems and history of depression. Adrian believed this made Charlie more established, but things were not as harmonious at home as Adrian had wanted. She attributed this to her husband's demanding job at the burn unit. Prior to marriage, when the two were dating, Adrian never saw Charlie drink. In fact, he had told her he couldn't drink, and Adrian took this as Charlie sticking to his principles rather than a red flag. But unfortunately, she was very wrong. Charlie was drinking again, and in a heavy way. Charlie would keep his booze of choice, mostly red wine and tropical mixes, sealed in a navy lockbox in their basement boiler room with the door locked as well. He started spending all his time in the basement drinking alone and enjoying time to himself. Nothing really says aloha like the dank, dark basement boiler room all alone. In February 1988, Adrian became pregnant with their firstborn and would give birth to a girl named Shauna, whose real name has been changed at the request of Adrian herself. But she felt that Charlie began to treat her more like a patient rather than a wife. He would give all his attention to the new baby and pretty much ignore Adrian. Charles Graeber, the author of The Good Nurse, puts it best when he wrote, quote, "Charlie was overly enthusiastic about new things, their relationship, their house, their life, but as the novelty faded, so did his affect." The same thing happened when the couple got a new puppy named Lady. At first, he was smitten with Lady. He pet her obsessively, groomed her, watched her eat, and paid more attention to her than to Adrian. But as time progressed, Charlie's interest wore out there too. One afternoon, when Adrian came home from work, while Charlie had been at home taking care of the dog and the new baby, Lady wasn't there. She was completely gone. When Adrian asked Charlie about it, he was totally indifferent and didn't want to go out and help look for her. Charlie told her that Lady probably ran away when he had left the baby sleeping to go out for a walk. Wait, rewind. When he had left the baby sleeping to go out for a walk? As in, alone in the house? Adrian was shocked, but again, Charlie was indifferent. He didn't see what the big deal was, and he certainly didn't seem concerned about finding Lady. Charlie had left the front door ajar when he had gone out for a walk and thought nothing of it. Charlie told Adrian it was not an issue because he knew that the baby wouldn't wake up. Adrian didn't like how he used that word, knew. Did Charlie give something to their baby to ensure she would remain asleep? The marriage entered a serious rough patch following this, and Adrian questioned whether she wanted to remain married. Her husband was distant, cold, and inattentive. Friends and family told Adrian to stick it out and that things would eventually get better. So once again, she chalked it up to stresses at work and went on with life. One thing that Adrian stated that I find oh so creepy was that she couldn't quite describe the disturbing look Charlie would get in his eyes from time to time. She said it was, quote, a cool blankness, and that his eyes would sometimes drift apart, watching two separate directions as if each eye belonged to a separate being. Like that. One afternoon, Adrienne answered the doorbell to find her neighbor crying. It wasn't uncommon for their neighbor's beagle Queenie to escape their yard and wander into the Collinses, where Adrienne would promptly return him and the neighbors would bond, laughing and making it an inside joke. But this time there was nothing to laugh about. Queenie's body was found in an alleyway beside their house and was determined by the veterinarian to have been poisoned. Adrienne was shocked and didn't know how to console her friend. When Adrienne went inside, she thought about Charlie and how odd he had been behaving. She thought about how Charlie had known that Shauna would stay asleep when he had gone out for a walk, and how she thought he had given her something. She also remembered photographs she had taken of Shauna at daycare playing with her friends. She remembered how Charlie had taken a pair of scissors and, with surgical precision, cut all the little boys out of the photos, leaving only ghost-like figures of negative space around their daughter. She thought about his stare, how his eyes were dead inside at times. She thought about these things, and now she thought about the deceased beagle found in the alley beside their house. Judge John W. Yango. In June 1987 in New Jersey, the only burn unit for the whole state was located at the St. Barnabas Medical Center, and because of this, it was the place where all burn victims would be taken. People with all levels of burn severities would be rushed in, and it was Charlie's job to tend to their wounds and clean them on the cold metal gurneys they had to lie on. He had to rinse and sponge all the singed and burnt flesh off the wounded with antibacterial soap, many of these victims being young children or the elderly. He had to tend to people who were involved in car crashes, house fires, manufacturing accidents, and chemical burns. Even with the use of morphine, screams of agony could always be heard coming from the burn ward. It was truly a demanding and horrific environment to work in, and I would assume only certain people would be able to stand the constant horror and pain around them. One of those people was Charlie Cullen. Suffering from third-degree burns means the epidermis, dermis, and deep tissue below is damaged. Destruction to muscle, veins, nerves, arteries, and bone could be present, and the burn would have a white or charred appearance. These burns are more deadly than second-degree burns, but less painful, as most of the nerve endings have been destroyed. Second-degree burns only affect the epidermis and dermis layers of the skin, but leave the nerves fully functioning, resulting in agony and extreme pain at the burn site. According to The Good Nurse, nearly a third of patients in the burn unit were children, who were sometimes burned as punishment for any variety of reasons, and Charlie was witness to all kinds of these burn injuries. Also, during this time in the 90s, nurses were not allowed to give children pain medication more powerful than Tylenol 3. But some nurses who could not stand seeing the children in such discomfort would give them something with a bit more kick. Here is an excerpt from the book The Good Nurse that depicts the gruesome world of working with people in the burn ward, and as a warning, it is not discreet. If this is something that you don't think you can stomach, then you might want to skip ahead. Quote, "The kids came in hot and rising, hurting and reminding Charlie of his own hurt too. He would pick them up, these screaming, melted little people, knowing that later the surgeons would open each like a baked potato, a Y-cut to keep them from exploding, only the first of many operations to come. In time, their melted skin would heal into scars, vine-like ropes that the surgeons would cut again and again to prevent the neck from locking into an unbendable trunk to keep the arms flexible." Charlie said he liked working at St. Barnabas because he felt useful, needed, and he enjoyed tending to the injured and helpless. Now we fast forward to 1991, when the suspicious IV bags of heparin had been found to contain insulin, and patients Anna Byers and Fred Belf had been victims of the tainted bags. These bags would be found almost 3 years after Charlie's first admitted killing, the murder of Judge John W. Yango Sr. in 1988. Judge John Yengo was a municipal court judge in Jersey City with a controversial reputation regarding his conduct in the workplace and was nicknamed Maximum John for his harsh sentences he gave out to criminals. He was administered to St. Barnabas Burn Unit with a rare allergic reaction called Stevens-Johnson syndrome at the age of 72. His death was attributed to this reaction at the time in 1988, but in 2004, after Charlie's arrest, Charlie admitted that he had given the judge a lethal injection, making him the first victim of Charlie Cullen's 16-year nursing career. After being alerted to the findings of the tainted IV bags involved with Anna Byers and Fred Belf, Thomas Arnold, Assistant Director of Security at St. Barnabas, began an investigation into the case. He went back through patient records in the CCU to see if there had been any other crashes due to insulin, and he found that there had been many patients coding and crashing for that very reason. Testing showed that the insulin levels had again been off the charts, and on top of that, the insulin was also foreign. It had not been naturally produced within the patients themselves. It had to have been administered to the patients. It was first assumed that these had been human errors due to improper labeling of vials or misreading of a doctor's orders, but after a thorough study of the charts, it was discovered that none of the patients had ever even been prescribed insulin. Arnold went to the head of St. Barnabas Security, Joe Barry, a 30-year police veteran and former major, and they together began a deep investigation into the matter. To start, they ruled out any possible involvement by the patient's family and visitors. Then they had to turn the investigation inwards and look at hospital staff. After identifying the dates and times the patients had coded, they compared those to the work schedules of nurses and got a lead. Only 3 nurses showed to have been working during every incident, and Charlie Cullen was one of them. Now, at this time, Charlie was no longer working the burn unit, but had been moved to critical care. And Arnold would later state that they never even got around to checking coded patients from that ward. So there could have been many previous incidents of insulin-spiked bags and crashes that went undetected. Initially, Charlie and 2 other nurses were key suspects, and although one was found not guilty, the other nurse was actually found to be stealing morphine, but that's another story. Arnold and Barry began interviewing the nurses at the hospital, and many were scared and nervous about their jobs. They had their reputation and careers on the line. But Charlie was different in his unwillingness to speak with security, heightening their suspicions of him. When they were eventually able to get him alone for questioning, Charlie showed no signs of distress or trepidation and was completely uncooperative with them. When Arnold accused Charlie of lacing the heparin bags with insulin, saying that they knew it was him who did it, all Charlie said in return was, quote, "You can't prove anything." This response was not the response of an innocent man in Arnold and Barry's opinion. So they dug even deeper into the investigation, getting some of the other nurses to assist in checking patient chart records, schedules, video surveillance, medical charts, and more, all within and around Charlie's employment and previously worked shifts. Although they found many connections and questionable coincidences, they had no proof. Medicine and disease are complicated. The human body isn't black and white, and they couldn't connect Charlie with certainty to any of their findings, so they decided to involve police, specifically Chief of Police Don Jones, on March 5, 1991. But Jones would not get involved, telling Arnold and Barry that there wasn't enough evidence yet and that it would be best if they continued the investigation themselves internally. So that's what they did. They pulled all their resources and efforts together to catch Charlie red-handed. They installed cameras in the med storage closet, issued new drug sign-out procedures, which previously was only necessary for drugs like morphine, and expanded their interviews to include doctors, patients, family members, and other hospital staff. Soon, 2 more patients would crash due to hypoglycemia in mysterious ways, and again, their IV bags showed high levels of insulin. But Charlie was nowhere to be seen. The staffing agency that Charlie was employed with, called Medical Center Healthcare Services, a subsidiary of St. Barnabas Healthcare Corporation, had flagged his file "Do Not Book" on account of, quote, "poor attitude, a habit of making decisions that were not in the best interest of the patients, and errors with prescribing medications. Charlie was no longer being scheduled at St. Barnabas. Back at the Cullen house, Charlie came up with an elaborate lie to tell his wife regarding his newfound time off. He told Adrian that there was a nurses' strike at the hospital and he was against it because it wasn't putting the patient's well-being first, and he was all about help thy patients first. So they were punishing him and making him a scapegoat. Confused, Adrian asked what he was being a scapegoat for, and he told her about the tainted IV bags. He told her the whole story about the high insulin concentration in the bags, the patient's coding, and the investigation. He just left out the part that he had been the culprit. In fact, he told Adrian that the hospital had no idea who was behind it, and that made them look bad. So they needed someone to pin it on, and that person was Charlie. So they fired him. During this time at home, Charlie waited for the axe to fall, for the perfect incriminating piece of evidence to finally be found and put him away, but it never came. Charlie had even stated after his arrest years later that he kind of enjoyed the rush of not knowing if each coffee was his last before they booked him. But again, they never came, and 2 weeks later, Charlie interviewed for a new job at Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, January 21st, 1992. You see, Charlie still had an impressive resume, especially with his time working the burn unit at St. Barnabas, and on top of that, he was willing to work all of the shifts no one else wanted to work. Holidays, weekends, overnight shifts, so getting a new job for him was easy. When the interviewer at Warren Hospital asked Charlie why he wanted to leave his old job, he told her it was simply a matter of the commute and that he wanted a job closer to his family. In fact, Adrian noticed a big change in her husband's mood with the new job. He was excited about medicine again and was even given a pay increase from his last job. He also started working day shifts to free up more time at home with Adrian and their daughter. Things seemed to be going well for the Cullens, but it was short-lived. Their second child, Saskia, which I think is another alias, but I can't confirm that, had been born in December 1991, but Charlie had not been the best father over the last year. He had even started drinking again, and it wasn't that much of a secret anymore. They fell into a never-ending cycle of Adrian confronting Charlie about his drinking, Charlie gaslighting her and downplaying the issue, fighting, and then Charlie not remembering the next day or choosing not to acknowledge it. Night after night, Adrian tried to get her husband to stop the drinking, but Charlie wanted to drink, and each night he would just go down to the basement and drink alone in peace. Eventually, it became too much for Adrian, and in November 1992, she decided she wanted to pursue a divorce. But the two would continue to live together until Charlie was able to afford to move out. In January 1993, the police were called to the Cullen house for domestic violence, and on top of that accusation, Adrian took the opportunity to spill everything she had bottled up inside for years about Charlie to the police. She told them about the investigation at St. Barnabas Hospital and the IV bags. She told them about the odd incidents surrounding their missing dog Lady, a slew of other animals they had housed over the years, including fish, hamsters, and ferrets, as well as the incident involving their neighbor's beagle Queenie. She hadn't put the pieces together that Charlie was actually responsible for the events at the hospital, but she wanted the extra leverage for her own protection. She told the police he was guilty of animal abuse, and she divulged to them all his previous suicide attempts. Charlie was furious. He believed himself to be many things, but he drew the line at domestic abuser. He would never hurt his wife, no matter how big of a piece of garbage he was. So, in retaliation, Charlie overdosed on pills with a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon. Michelle Tomlinson. Charlie met Michelle Tomlinson, a fellow nurse at Warren Hospital, on January 31st, 1993 in the ICU while recovering from his previous suicide attempt. Charlie liked Michelle and looked forward to their long conversations after all other patients had been tended to. They passed the time talking about their lives and personal problems in a deprecating light, and he believed Michelle to be as depressed as he was. Michelle was a new mother working full-time at the hospital and going through a divorce as well. Michelle was attentive, caring, and Charlie wanted things to be more than just a friendship. but Michelle was in a start and stop relationship with a man named Jerry. After getting to know Charlie, Michelle suggested he spend some time in Muhlenberg Psychiatric Unit in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. She said she knew good people who worked there and thought Charlie would like it. So he took her advice and was transferred there. She would still visit him, bring him flowers, and they would continue their conversations. Charlie could always make her laugh even in his condition. They would always try to one-up each other's wretched life stories and even made a running joke of it, calling them, quote, pity parties. Charlie was becoming more and more infatuated with Michelle, and after he returned to work to find out she had split from Jerry, he promptly asked her out for dinner. She was a little hesitant to date coworkers, but agreed nonetheless. After their first date, Charlie was hooked. He had fallen in love with Michelle and laid the charisma on thick. He would bring her daily treats and leave romantic gifts for her at the hospital, but Michelle would ignore them. So Charlie tried harder. He came in on his days off to see her and followed her around trying to make her laugh. When he told her he loved her, Michelle didn't reciprocate, and she tried avoiding him by working more and saying she didn't have time to chat with him during their shifts together, that her patients needed her. Charlie was obsessed with Michelle. He would call her house and leave many unreturned messages on her machine. He would go about his days only half cognizant of his surroundings because he was thinking of Michelle and how she had not returned his affections. He concluded that it wasn't him, she must just be depressed. His belief of this only solidified his certainty that they were soulmates and that she needed him as much as he needed her. So he called her again and again without answer. When the phone finally rang back, it was Jerry on the other end. Jerry said, quote, "Look, Michelle is really upset. She's hysterical after this." But it didn't sink in, and Charlie believed Michelle wanted him to save her. She may have even been suicidal. Charlie would drive back and forth around Michelle's block, looking into her window, hoping to get a glance in to see if any lights were on. He would leave a message on her phone from his house, then drive to her house to see if anyone was home to receive it. Then he would drive back home again in case she was trying to call back. He would see that there had been no messages left on his answering machine, but press the button anyways in case the light wasn't working. But Michelle never called back, and Charlie drove to her house one last time in the middle of the night. He peered through the front door window, but there was no movement, so he took a brick and threw it in. When no one came to investigate, Charlie let himself in, made his way to her bedroom, and stood in the doorway watching her. Then he left. He drove to a convenience store and waited until the sun came up so he could call Michelle again. She finally answered and was distraught, telling Charlie that someone had broken into her apartment in the middle of the night while her and her son were asleep. She felt completely violated. Then calmly, Charlie told Michelle, quote, "I was the one who did your house. I wanted to check on you, to make sure you were okay, that you didn't try anything, like suicidal." He then told her he was feeling a little crazy and he would understand if she called the police. She absolutely did, and a warrant for Charlie's arrest was issued. Charlie was to report to the police station immediately, and he did. But first he downed a handful of Xanax and the narcotic Darvocet for a total of 20 pills combined. After a short stint in the police station, Charlie was ambulanced to the hospital and then to Greystone Psychiatric Hospital at Morristown, formerly the New Jersey Lunatic Asylum at Morristown. To Charlie's surprise, and also mine, Warren Hospital wanted him to eventually come back to work. Everyone knew about his suicide attempt as he had been brought there by the ambulance, and they knew he had been stalking Michelle. So this surprised him. Charlie was given a new position at work. He now worked in telemetry, which was the, quote, halfway ward, a sort of purgatory between the eyes-on intensity of intensive care and the hotel-like existence of a regular hospital inpatient. The ward was primarily reserved for heart patients, not the critical ones, but those on the mend, whose stability might suddenly nosedive. These patients were also hooked up to a plethora of wires and a machine called the electrocardiogram, or EKG. This can be a nerve-wracking experience, hearing the blips and beeps from the machines all the time, which is not good for a healing heart. So Charlie's job was to educate them. He told them they were essentially hooked up to polygraph tests, and when you understand how they worked, they weren't that scary or intimidating anymore. Quote, blood comes in the top of the heart and flows out the bottom, pushed by the squeezing of the chambers, atria to ventricle. The squeeze is triggered by an electronic pulse. The EKG translates those electronic pulses into a picture, drawn by an inked needle jerking across rolling graph paper. Charlie had even taken 2 polygraphs at his own request to dispel Adrian's accusations that he drank while watching the children and was guilty of domestic abuse during their divorce proceedings. Although he passed the tests, Adrian was still granted a restraining order from Charlie in the final verdict. Simultaneously to the divorce, Charlie was also charged with stalking, breaking and entering, trespassing, and harassment for his actions with Michelle. Financially, Charlie was maxed out and desperately needed a public defender, but even with the child support and counseling fees, his income bracket was too high, and he was forced to pay for a lawyer out of his own pocket. In fact, at this point, Charlie had wanted out of nursing, but felt he had to continue to pay for his legal fees. But things did not work out smoothly, and his lawyer actually quit, saying that Charlie was too difficult to work with. So Charlie represented himself. This would prove to be too challenging, and Charlie just ended up pleading guilty to the charges of trespassing and harassment. He received no jail time, just a fine and probation, but it was still too much for Charlie, and he attempted suicide again when he got home. He mixed pills and wine, the usual, and then proceeded to drive himself to Warren Hospital Emergency, where he was treated again. Charlie wanted to be seen by others as a good person. He wanted to be seen as caring, a good father, and someone you could be friends with. Adrian and Michelle had started off seeing him as those things. His mother had loved him, and he had friends at the hospital, but he very much wanted his daughters to see him as this. He fought to keep them and genuinely wanted them in his life. But with all his suicide attempts, drinking, and allegations by Adrian, he was losing the battle for them in the courtroom as well. Helen Dean. Charlie was drawn to Helen Dean and her devoted son Larry, who never left her bedside while she was in hospital recovering from breast cancer surgery. Helen was elderly but recovering well, and was scheduled to leave the hospital the next morning on September 2nd, 1993. Charlie went to the medicine cabinet and took out 3 ampules of digoxin, concealing them within his palm. Dig, as the nurses called it, or dig, is used to treat cardiac arrhythmia and is a relative of the digitalis foxglove plant. Digitalis, meaning finger-like, refers to the look of a plant which has many bell-shaped flowers stemming off a singular stem, like fingers. Digoxin is made using the leaf extract. Acute digoxin overdose will cause the patient to suffer confusion, an irregular pulse, anorexia, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, an accelerated heartbeat, and sometimes vision irregularities. According to Larry, he didn't recognize Charlie when he entered his mother's hospital room and had never seen him before around the hospital, despite being there every day since his mother's admittance. What stuck out to Larry were Charlie's scrubs. While every other nurse was wearing blue, Charlie was wearing all white scrubs. Charlie told Larry to leave his mother's room, so Larry went and got a coffee down the hallway and waited. When he returned to his mother, she told him that the nurse had stuck her with a needle on her inner thigh. Larry complained to the doctor, but was told that the little red mark could be just a bug bite, letting the matter go at that. Sadly, the next day, Helen became violently ill and died shortly after. Larry was distraught and brought the matter to his mother's oncologist, telling them about the weird nurse in white. The oncologist would confirm that Helen did not, in fact, have any injections scheduled during her treatment. So Larry brought the matter to his mother's other nurses, eventually finding out the nurse in white was named Charles Cullen. Larry would take this matter to the Warren County prosecutor, accusing Charlie of murdering his mother, but nothing would proceed with his accusations. Larry would spend the next 8 years fighting the case that his mother had been murdered, but would pass away in 2001 before any charges could be realized. Tragically, he died only 2 years shy of Charlie's arrest and would never see justice served for his mother's murder. Side note, some of Helen Dean's blood and tissue samples would be found in her son Larry's freezer after her death. Feel about that how you will. Charlie would be investigated multiple times over the next days by the Warren County Prosecutor's Office, doctors, nurse supervisors, administrators, and the Major Crime Investigation Unit, but maintained his innocence. During Helen's autopsy, the medical examiner tested the pinprick site for upwards of 100 lethal drugs, but never tested for digoxin, and Helen was determined to have died from natural causes. Charlie even passed a polygraph test stating that he did not inject Mrs. Dean with any needles. Charlie was, however, placed on indefinite paid leave effective immediately, with his absence lasting until the new year. But Charlie was over Warren Hospital and decided to move on, getting a job at Hunterdon Hospital ICU in Flemington, New Jersey. Charlie knew what references to provide on his resume and which ones to leave off, and thus was given a good review. It was stated that he left Warren Hospital for personal reasons. Charlie did well at Hunterdon and received rave reviews from his superior Marjorie Whalen for being an exemplary employee, stating he was, quote, organized, giving of his time, a patient advocate, so much to offer, very bright, witty, and intelligent. Charlie also started dating a woman named Kathy, another nurse on the same ward, but his good behavior was short-lived, and Charlie returned to his dark ways shortly after in 1995. He began injecting so many people he lost track, and after his arrest in 2003, would change his statement many times regarding the exact details of the murders at Hunterdon. As far as actual deaths, however, he believed he killed one person in January 1995 and several spanning from April to June of the same year, all patients of the ICU. Charlie was now being written up constantly for bad performance, and he was accused by other nurses as being unprofessional, creepy, and negligent. One patient on Charlie's watch was discovered lying face up staring at the ceiling in his hospital bed, surrounded by bloody cloths and empty bottles. He was naked, oxygen-starved, and died of a stroke shortly after. It is believed that Charlie's actions contributed to this patient's death, but were never confirmed. Charlie was also acting extremely sketchy with patients' medications, administering drugs that were never prescribed to some patients, and neglecting to give required drugs necessary for treatment to others. He was failing to record drugs he was administering on charts and began taking on the role of doctor, ordering lab tests that he did not have authority to order. After killing a patient named Jesse Eichen with an overdose of digoxin on July 9, 1996, his supervisor Marjorie had brought Charlie into her office and told him that his odd and disturbing behavior was becoming too much and one more incident would leave him terminated. She knew that Charlie wasn't a good fit at Hunterdon, but she didn't know that he was intentionally killing patients. Charlie didn't take the threat well. Not only did Kathy recently leave him and return to her husband, but he held much resentment towards his supervisor Marjorie and the rest of the staff at Hunterdon. They didn't understand him, and that's even without knowing he was giving people fatal doses of drugs. So instead of letting himself be fired, he wrote Marjorie a not-so-nicely worded letter of resignation, and thus ended his time at Hunterdon Medical. It was easy for Charlie to get new employment, and his staffing agency quickly found him a full-time job at Morristown Memorial Hospital. He worked the night shift from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. in the cardiac care unit, but once again, Charlie's performance was inadequate, and the nurses that would take over his shifts in the morning would complain about the state the patients were left in. Nurses would come to work to find the workstation a disaster. The patients would be covered in their own blood, their dirty cloths would be left sitting in the sink, and waste and debris would be strewn all over the counters. His supervisors kept a close watch on him, and he was found to once again be negligent, administering drugs to patients that weren't his and giving out the wrong doses of Diprivan and heparin. He was fired within a year of working at Morristown for inadequate working performance. When asked about patients that he may have killed during this time by detectives in 2003, Charlie stated that he couldn't remember exact details but was sure there was at least one or two people he murdered at Morristown. Charlie retaliated to the firing by attempting to commit suicide again by overdosing on pills. Charlie felt that when no one else cared about his pain, the ER attendants always did. I believe Charlie liked the attention, as he was always sure to tell the paramedics he was a registered nurse. He was one of them, and he would speak to them using medical jargon to prove it. Charlie was taken back to Warren Hospital again, where he was remembered as the, quote, suicidal stalker, but he didn't care. He had one goal, to get back to Greystone, except he could only get there with a doctor's referral. Charlie got his wish and was admitted to Greystone the day before Halloween in 1997. Francis Henry. After Charlie left Greystone on December 11, 1997, he was in debt $66,888 due to the many months between jobs and legal fees. So he took a job at Liberty Nursing and Rehabilitation Center of Allentown in Pennsylvania through his staffing agency. Interestingly, however, when Morristown was contacted for a reference, they only confirmed his previous employment and never mentioned why he had been terminated. On top of that, his previous supervisor from Hunterdon Hospital, Marjorie Whalen, the same supervisor who had threatened to fire him, recommended him for employment upon being contacted. By this time, his oldest daughter, Shauna, was 9, and Charlie was afraid that if he didn't pay his child support, Adrian might sour his name to her, if she didn't conclude that he was a poor father on her own. Charlie went to work at the Liberty Nursing Home each night with his mind filled with these anxieties. During these night shifts, Charlie noticed a man named Francis Henry, a senior residing at Liberty who had a broken vertebrae and needed to wear a halo device. A halo device is that metal ring that kind of goes around your head and is like screwed into your skull, and it's attached with rods that are supported by chest harnesses, with the intent to keep your neck and spine in alignment. Charlie didn't think this man should be recovering at the nursing home. He thought Francis should be in a hospital. So Charlie made sure of this. He injected Francis's IV bag with a very large dose of insulin, and over the evening of May 6, 1998, Francis went into diabetic shock, quote, "The results were almost unimaginably violent. Charlie Cullen had put an elderly man with a broken neck into violent seizures." Francis was sent to the hospital for a short time after going into a coma, and upon his return to Liberty, was placed on morphine drip, but died soon after. It was not determined by Liberty if the insulin was in fact the cause of Francis's death, but there had been very high levels of extraneous insulin found in his bloodstream, despite not having been prescribed to him. An investigation into Francis's death was launched, and the large insulin levels in his blood were discovered, raising suspicion on the night staff right away. Charlie's performance had also been scrutinized several times beforehand, and he had been written up multiple times for undisclosed issues. So Charlie believed it was all over for him. It wouldn't be until years later during his police confessions that Charlie would state he had been Francis's executioner. Surprisingly, it was a senior nurse named Kimberly Pepp that was fired for the incident, not Charlie. Kimberly's lawyer filed a wrongful termination suit against Liberty and even insinuated that Charlie was more likely the culprit, given all of his suspicious activity beforehand, going so far to even state that Charlie was originally being investigated for the incident by Liberty. Liberty denied ever investigating Charlie, and Kimberly's suit was settled sometime later outside of court, with the asking amount being over $50,000 in damages. It is still unknown how or why Kimberly was targeted for this incident, and Liberty would confess that their investigation into Francis Henry's death was never concluded. Charlie was moved out of the ICU and into the psychiatric wing, but would eventually be dismissed due to issues following proper drug protocol procedures. Charlie would only be out of work a few days and was hired through the staffing agency at Easton Hospital in Easton, Pennsylvania, where he was back in the ICU working the overnight shifts. Audemars Schramm. Audemars Schramm was administered to Easton Hospital in December 1998 due to aspirated food in his lungs, meaning that he took a deep inhale while chewing and the food went down the wrong tube into his lungs. He had also been having strokes throughout the previous year, resulting in clots, rendering him more and more dependent on care. Christina Toth, his daughter, was by his side diligently and looked after him during his stay in the hospital, helping him put his socks on and maneuvering stairs, even keeping tabs on the nurses and hospital staff that assisted her father. Charlie had been one of those nurses. Christina remembers her father being taken out of his hospital room for tests, and although she wasn't surprised by this, she was surprised by the syringes the nurse was using. He told her that they were in case Audemars' heart ceased, and although Christina didn't believe there was any issue regarding her father's heart, she didn't want to question the professionals. The next morning when Christina checked on her father, his condition had worsened, and the doctors did not attribute this to his preceding stroke. It was his heart. It was beating irregularly, and his blood pressure took a nosedive. Disheartened, Christina began preparing for her father's passing. But to her astonishment, 2 days later, Audemars got better. He was more cognizant and his condition was steadying. Christina and Audemars' wife would visit daily, bringing cookies and warm meals to make his stay more enjoyable, and things were looking up for the family. But the situation would take a shocking twist. On the third night, Christina received a strange phone call at home from her father's family doctor, Dr. Robert Silberman. Silberman informed Christina that an unknown individual had ordered a series of blood tests to be performed on her father and that their results were equally as suspicious. Throughout Audemars' admission at Easton, no prescriptions for digoxin were ever made, yet extremely large levels of the drug were found in his system. Dr. Silberman was baffled and told Christina that he would call again after further testing was done and when he had more information. But sadly, the next call he made to her was at 1:25 a.m. the following morning, informing Christina that her father had passed away and the new tests were comparable to the previous ones. Based off police interviews with Christina, she recounted what Silberman told her to do. He informed her, quote, "When you get to the hospital, they will ask you if you want an autopsy performed. If I were you, I would say yes." Christina didn't fully understand. However, Dr. Silberman didn't want to say anything further. He only clarified that it was because of the digoxin that she should be suspicious. The next morning, Christina and her family went back to the hospital to see Audemars, and Charlie was there finishing up his night shift, almost as if he was waiting for them to arrive. He led them into the room where Audemars' body was resting after being cleaned and groomed. Christina got a gnawed feeling from Charlie when he told her, quote, "I'll give you some time," as if he was granting her some gift out of his own generosity to spend time with her deceased father. When Charlie returned, he asked Christina and the family if they would be requesting an autopsy be performed. Thinking back to the forewarning Dr. Silberman had told her on the phone, she said that yes, they believed they were going to request an autopsy. But this was not the answer Charlie wanted to hear, saying, quote, "Why would you want an autopsy?" He proceeded to remind them of Audemars' will, which outlined his preference against extraordinary measures to be used, such as life support, and an autopsy would be more invasive than that even. Without offering a response, Christina just asked Charlie to leave. Soon after, another nurse came in and asked Christina the same question regarding an autopsy. She maintained her stance that they were most likely going to ask for one to be done, and that the nurse left. Christina thought that this hospital was not communicating to one another very well, a belief that was magnified when a third nurse entered the room, also asking Christina if the family would be requesting an autopsy. Now Christina was angry and snapped back, quote, "Yes, we want an autopsy. Of course we do. Someone gave my father an overdose and..." But she was cut off, and the nurse advised that she say nothing further. An internal investigation into the death of Audemars Schramm did in fact reveal that there were high levels of digoxin in his system at the time of his death. The autopsy was then transferred to the county coroner, Zachary Lysek, who was at first skeptical how the digoxin could have accidentally entered Audemars' system. After further investigation, he began to believe it could have been intentional. He spent months following up with Easton staff and the staff of the nursing home Audemars lived in before his death. He spoke with Christina, who had mentioned the sketchy nurse that had the syringes and had gifted her time with her deceased father. But it was no matter. She didn't have a name, and the forensic pathologist determined the cause of death was due to pneumonia, with digoxin being a secondary influence, and his death was ruled as accidental. Lysak wasn't so sure though, but unfortunately, he had no proof of wrongdoing. Interestingly enough, Lysak was contacted 3 years later by a mysterious source, informing him that the sketchy nurse Christina had described was Charlie Cullen. But when Lysak reached out to Easton for his employment records, there was no employee on file by that name. You see, Charlie had been getting all his work through staffing agencies, and it was only through those records that any word of him would be found, and at the time of the investigation, forensic investigators failed to ask these kinds of questions. Matthew Matern and Stella Danielczyk. It wasn't long after Ottmar Schramm's death that Charlie moved on to yet another hospital, and by the time any questions were arising about his involvement in the incident, Charlie was back working the burn unit at Lehigh Valley Hospital. Interesting fact, the burn units were now far more advanced regarding pain medication than they were when Charlie first started his career back in the 80s. Now, instead of morphine, OxyContin, which entered the market in 1996, was commonly being used to treat discomfort. Charlie didn't get along well with the staff at Lehigh Hospital, and for the next 16 months while employed there, found other ways to entertain himself over the long night shifts. Charlie was starting to lose count at this point as to how many patients he was killing. After Charlie's arrest years later, he told police that he may have slipped the syringe to 4 or 5 people at Lehigh. He couldn't remember, but 2 were eventually confirmed: 73-year-old Stella Danielczyk and 22-year-old Matthew Matern. Both Stella and Matthew had suffered severe burns over most of their body, and both were considered grim cases according to the Rule of Nines. The Rule of Nines is a tool used on burn patients to determine the overall percentage of surface area suffering from burns, and in turn give a reading on the gravity and the intensity of the burn. This measurement also helps determine a burn patient's survival rate when calculated alongside their age. In the Rule of Nines, the body is divided into sections, each a multiple of 9. The head is 9%, each arm is 9%, each leg is 18%, the torso is 18%, and the genitalia is 1%. Following this rule, Stella was not expected to live as she had burns over 60% of her body, and Matthew, with burns over 70% of his body, was a miracle case, with his only hope being that he was still young enough that his body could possibly survive through the ordeal. Matthew, who had been trapped in a burning car wreck, was a hard case to handle for even seasoned nurses at Lehigh. They could all relate to him in some way, either as a son, a friend, a partner, or a sibling, and according to the Rule of Nines, Matthew was 92% dead. His body was slowly whittled away with each surgery to try and save him, but the burns went as deep as his bones, and many of his extremities had to be removed. He underwent many surgeries to replace muscle tissue over the charred bone, but infection kept setting in, and with each new infection, Matthew had to undergo another surgery, further adding stress to his recovery. Even if he did survive all the surgeries and his burns, he would forever be covered in scars, and many of the nurses half hoped he could once and for all be free of his pain indefinitely. When Charlie looked at Matthew, he was reminded of his own helplessness as a child growing up, but this time he could do something about it. And on August 31st, 1999, Charlie went into Matthew's hospital room, loaded his IV with a substantial amount of digoxin, and then recoiled back into the darkness to watch his work. Matthew died just before sundown. Stella met the same fate. Charlie also injected her IV with digoxin on February 26, 2000, and she coded shortly after. True to form, Charlie would soon leave Lehigh Hospital and move on to St. Luke's Hospital in Forest Hill. Having drafted an email to 2 individuals referring to them as Nazi SS, and then accidentally sending it to the entire burn unit's senior service staff, Charlie had become extremely unliked. Note, next time you're going to write to a friend where you refer to your colleagues as members of the Third Reich, better be darn sure they aren't all CC'd in the email. Needless to say, he wasn't the favorite amongst the group there and promptly found employment at St. Luke's, but not before taking his frustrations out on a few more patients prior to leaving. Again, it is estimated that he killed 4 or 5 victims during his time at Lehigh. Things were going well for Charlie at St. Luke's, and he even began to develop feelings for a fellow nurse named Julie. Just as he had done with Adrienne and Michelle, he adorned her with little gifts and would leave her presence at the nurse's stand, but under the guise of a secret identity, Brian Flynn. It was hot gossip at the hospital, and all the nurses flocked around Julie with each new gift, wanting to get more information on who this mysterious Brian Flynn individual was. Charlie, who watched from the sidelines, loved the indirect attention, but he couldn't contain the secret for long. He professed to Julie and the other nurses that he was the suave Brian Flynn, but this information was not greeted with the loving attention he had hoped. In fact, quite the opposite. The men found it hilarious, and the women were apprehensive, even coming off a little afraid. Charlie immediately missed the anonymity of being Brian Flynn, and now just felt spurned and mortified. Not surprisingly, Charlie soon stopped enjoying his time working at St. Luke's. This was a prestigious hospital and ranked one of the best by U.S. News and World Report magazine. However, the staff seemed to be unappreciative and unprofessional, not to mention the whole Brian Flynn incident. Some of the male staff would play hacky sack with rolls of tape between patient codes and smash bottles of nitroglycerin, a heart medication, in the parking lot to see if it would explode. This was not acceptable in Charlie's opinion. You know, Charlie, the multiple murderer. So Charlie did what he always did to subdue the anger. He injected patients. He also started to do something new, something just for him, and something purely out of spite for the hospital. In the spring, nurses started noticing that bottles of Pronestal, a medication used to treat cardiac arrhythmias, started disappearing from the medicine room. It was a drug that had previously always been there, as it wasn't commonly used. Each afternoon it would be restocked, and then each morning it would always be empty again. This would continue for 6 months, but no one had a clue where it was going or who was using it. It even became a running joke amongst the nursing staff, with one woman saying, quote, "Somebody must be using the stuff as fertilizer." No one investigated this reoccurring event, and to that I kind of have to say, really? This was the one time Charlie wanted someone to investigate the issue and be upset by it, because it turns out Charlie had been taking the Pronestal and tossing it in the trash each night, just for fun and just to piss off the hospital. So he wanted the satisfaction of knowing it was causing the hospital distress and financial woes. June 1st, 2001 was a dreary Saturday, and Charlie was having a particularly bad day. He enjoyed the weekends where the sun was shining and his kids would come and play with him in the yard. They would pick flowers, make pretty hairdos, and then go to Dairy Queen where they could get anything they wanted. This was not one of those weekends, and Charlie went to work in a sour mood for his 7 p.m. night shift. He went about his regular routine by taking the newly delivered batch of meds to the med closet to refill them and prepare the IVs for that shift. But when he got there, he noticed the Pronestal and how it was fully stocked again despite having thrown out the previous batch. Charlie was furious. Why were they pushing his buttons like this? Charlie left the med room a little more pleased than when he had entered, and the hospital would be out hundreds of dollars more in medicine than when Charlie had started his shift. When Kim Wolf, a day nurse at St. Luke's starting her shift the next morning, went to go prepare the IVs for that day, she noticed something odd when she dropped the used syringe into the sharps box. There was no clink sound of the needle hitting the bottom, or anything at all for that matter. The sharps box is the hazardous waste container that nurses and doctors dispose of used needles or other medicinal waste into, and it gets collected by environmental services biohazard specialists and disposed of properly at third-party sites for incineration. Suspicious, Kim investigated the sharps box and saw not used syringes, but white cardboard boxes. She immediately went to tell colleagues Gary Kimball, a 16-year veteran in that unit, and Candy Walmark. The three went back to investigate the sharps box, and sure enough, something odd was determined to be going on. After a call to environmental services, who were the only people that had the key and authority to open the hazardous waste container, An inspection was made into its bizarre contents. After meticulously sorting the boxes of meds from the used syringes, Gary and Candy began to catalog and list their findings. In the sharps box was, and I'm going to do my best to pronounce all of these medications correctly, 6 bottles of vicronium bromide, or VEC for short, magnesium sulfate, phenylephrine, levofed, dobutamine, nitroglycerin, labetalol, and 40 boxes of Pronestal, which when you put them all together makes a Twinkie. This was like nothing they had seen before. It wasn't uncommon for addictive painkillers such as ketamine, OxyContin, Vicodin, Percocet, Demerol, and morphine to go missing or fall under suspicious activity. But why these drugs? These drugs held no recreational value to them. The vicronium bromide being found here, however, scared them greatly because all the vials were empty. VEC starts out in powder form and can only be accessed by syringe through a stopper at the top of the vial. The syringe is injected into the rubber stopper and delivers a saline solution into the VEC powder. Once shaken together, the VEC, which has now dissolved into the saline, can be extracted via syringe and inserted into an IV bag. It is powerful stuff and it's taken seriously. This is because an overdose of VEC is terrifying. VEC is a non-depolarizing neuromuscular blocking agent, meaning it is a paralytic. Overdosing on VEC would cause the victim to go into a state of paralysis and have respiratory failure, meaning they would slowly and painfully suffocate to death. The most frightening part of this is that you're still fully conscious and can feel, but you can't move or scream. This is one of my biggest fears, and I can't watch scenes about this in horror movies. The idea of being paralyzed while still being conscious haunts my dreams. It's pure evil. This is why the drug isn't very popular, and when used is only done so in very small quantities, approximately 5 milligrams or so. The amount that Gary and Candy found missing was around 60 milligrams. So needless to say, they were pretty scared. Also adding to the mystery was that none of the patients over the last 4 days had been prescribed any VEC. So there was no reason at all why any of it was missing from the vials. Gary, Kim, and Candy monitored the medicine closet for the rest of their shift, and although they saw a few people go in and out, keeping the door propped open and only spending a minute or two inside at a time, they saw nothing suspicious. Besides, everyone had kept the door open, so everything they were doing inside was visible to all the staff on the floor nearby. It wasn't until Charlie came in for his shift just before 7 p.m. that suspicions rose. Charlie had popped into the medicine room, letting the door lock behind him, and it was a full 5 minutes before he exited again. As soon as Charlie was out of sight, Kim ran to the med room, punched in the key code, went inside, and peered into the sharps box. To her shock, it was full again. The 3 sleuths contacted the floor manager, Ellen Amadeo, at her home immediately and told her they had a serious situation on their hands. During the following morning of June 3rd, the sharps box was inspected again, and like before, more empty vials of VEC and other drugs were found. Sadly, the damage had already been done. Charlie had injected patient Edward O'Toole during his night shift with the VEC, and he died sometime between the evening of June 2nd and the morning of June 3rd. Edward's death wasn't even investigated properly until many years later, leaving his cause of death as undetermined. The only reason we know how he died now is because of Charlie's confession to the offense after his arrest years later. This meant that Edward probably died alone and scared, aware and unable to yell for help while he slowly suffocated. By now, Ellen Amadeo had come into the hospital to monitor the situation, and protocols were set in place by risk manager Janice Radar to have the sharps box regularly checked, while not being overly obvious as to tip the perpetrator off. Because Charlie had already gone home for the day, the box remained empty, but lo and behold, at the end of his next shift, the sharps box was full again. Charlie became their number 1 suspect, and the St. Luke's in-house counsel, attorney Cy Trubb, was notified. Cy contacted local law firm Stevens & Johnson, specialists in criminal law and malpractice defense, and Paul Laughlin, Former Philadelphia Assistant District Attorney was called in to investigate who was putting the drugs in the Sharps box. He sat down with Charlie right away and asked him questions surrounding the missing drugs. Charlie was evasive and played dumb, saying he had heard about suspicious activity regarding the drugs, but he didn't know who was doing it or why. Paul and the rest of the hospital heads had all the evidence they needed, so they gave Charlie a kind of choice. Resign, and they would still give him impartial references while also keeping the incident off his record. Guess this is the approach a hospital needs to take to keep their title on the U.S. News and World Report's list of best hospitals in America. Sweep it under the rug. Charlie left St. Luke's that day by being escorted to the parking garage by hospital security, a first for him. Of course, it was easy for Charlie to get another nursing job, with references from Warren Hospital, Liberty Nursing and Rehabilitation Center, and now a neutral reference promised by St. Luke's, and he started his new job in the critical care unit at Somerset Medical Center in September 2002. It also didn't hurt that Charlie was still willing to work all the shifts that no one else wanted to work. Still on calls, shift work, nights, weekends, and holidays. Working the night shifts, Charlie befriended a curvaceous and pretty woman in her early 30s named Amy Loughran. Amy was an outspoken, straight-to-the-point kind of woman who was guilty of being brutally honest at times. Basically, the opposite of Charlie. But the two developed a strong friendship and probably one of Charlie's healthiest relationships to this point in his life. He could always make her laugh with his self-deprecating humor and stories from the Navy. He was also seeing a new lady at this time named Kathy, and this was a constant source of material for he and Amy's long and sometimes tiresome night shifts. When Amy got sick with advanced atrial fibrillation and had to take time off work, it hit Charlie hard, and he coped the only way he knew how, by killing patients. Charlie began killing without reason and without pattern, and during his time at Somerset, he lost track of exactly how many, which sounds like the same thing that happened with all the other hospitals too. He would inject patients with digoxin, norepinephrine, and on his 43rd birthday, he injected patients with pavulon, a paralytic comparable to vicronium bromide. And when all these patients started coding, Charlie was the one to get on top of their hospital beds and perform CPR, looking like the hero, the nurse that would do anything to save his patients. And he was praised for his actions. Jin Kyun Han and the Reverend Florian Gall. Miss Jin Han was admitted to Somerset June 12, 2003 with Hodgkin's lymphoma and heart disease, and was being administered digoxin in small doses of 0.125 milligrams by her cardiologist, Dr. Zarar Jalin. Her body was being kept at a healthy level of around 0.63 and was kept being administered digoxin for the next day. But when Dr. Jalin reviewed her EKG, he noticed that the digoxin was not helping her arrhythmias. In fact, it was hurting her, and he ordered an immediate stop to the drug. When Charlie started his shift 2 days later on the 14th, he looked through the patient charts and picked Jin at random, then went to work in the med drawer getting the digoxin. Charlie supposedly got the digoxin for another one of his patients on what was technically now the morning of the 15th, the Reverend Florian Gall, but I will talk more about him in a few minutes. For some reason, Charlie quickly canceled the order for digoxin after placing it, but the computerized system called Pyxis opened the drawer anyway and dispensed the drugs. It is believed that Charlie thought if he canceled the drug order quickly, then it wouldn't show up in the system. Make note of the order cancellations because they will play a pivotal role in the second part of the story. Charlie took the drugs and went to Jin's room. When he entered Jin's room, she was asleep, and he seized the opportunity. He injected Jin with 8 times the dose that was previously given to her by Dr. Jalin, raising the digoxin levels in her body from 0.63 to 9.94. Then Charlie worked the rest of his shift. At home, he spent the rest of his afternoon off in anticipation for his next stint on the 16th, where he would be able to come back to work and see the outcome of his heinous acts. However, when Charlie started his next shift, immediately checking Jin's charts, he was disappointed to see that, although getting extremely sick over the previous evening and vomiting severely, Jin had survived, although she would eventually die from cancer not long after her recovery. Dr. Shaleen had caught the elevated digoxin levels and immediately ordered a remedy. Charlie was disappointed, to say the least. Reverend Florian Gall arrived at Somerset with a high fever and swollen lymph nodes, representative of a bacterial infection and pneumonia. He needed a ventilator to help him breathe as his lungs were saturated with liquid, not adequately being able to distribute oxygen to his vital organs. His kidneys were failing him as well, and he needed a machine to help filter his blood. His sister Lucille Gall, previously an experienced nurse herself, stayed by his bedside whenever she could. When it was determined that Reverend Gall was having trouble with his heart, atrial fibrillation, he was prescribed digoxin to slow the atrium. Reverend Gall was on a day-by-day basis, and it was undetermined as to whether he would live or die. His sister and family, in preparation for his death, agreed to a DNR order, do not resuscitate, if death was the will of the Lord. Miraculously, the Reverend got better. His heart rate stabilized and the DNR was withdrawn, along with the digoxin he was being administered. He would even be able to go home with his family if he continued to get better. But on June 28th at 9:32 a.m., the worst happened, and Reverend Gall coded after suddenly going into cardiac arrest. The Reverend's charts showed something interesting, though. His digoxin levels were staggering, despite having been recently taken off the drug. Charlie was not the Reverend's nurse the night he coded, but he did make sure that he was close by. The Reverend's chart appeared to have similarities to 3 other patients who had coded and were showing elevated drug levels, not including Miss Jin Han, who luckily had survived. Due to these recent chart findings and the suspicious nature surrounding them, Risk Manager Mary Lund called a meeting on Tuesday, June 1st, 3 days after the death of Reverend Gall, with a handful of other important figures in the hospital to discuss the matter and deal with it internally. Those in attendance were William Coors, MD, Chief Medical Officer, Sharon Halswade, Chief Operating Officer, Anthony D'Aguilo, MD, Chairperson of Pathology, Kathy Puder, Laboratory Services, Stuart Victor, Director of Pharmacy, Nancy Doherty, Pharmacy, Mary Jo Goodman, Registered Nurse, Director of Critical Care Cardiology, Valerie Smith, Registered Nurse, Manager of Critical Care, Darylyn Paul, Registered Nurse, Critical Care, and Linda Vesia, Registered Nurse Certified, Manager, Quality and Risk Improvement. So, needless to say, people were starting to take serious notice of these overdoses, finally. Priority 1 was checking the Pyxis machine's data surrounding the time of the suspicious digoxin levels. A Pyxis machine is sort of like a computerized filing cabinet for medications. It tracks all medication levels, times of withdrawals, and personnel accessing it. Another major priority was calling poison control to see just how much digoxin had to be administered to achieve the high numbers indicated on the patient charts, a task that would be delegated to pharmacist Nancy Doherty. And special interest would be given to both Ms. Jin Han and Reverend Florian Gall. Charlie didn't know it yet, but his ultimate demise was underway, and steps were being taken to find out, once and for all, who or what was behind the mysterious deaths plaguing hospitals for years in the New Jersey and Pennsylvania areas. And it all started with a phone call from pharmacist Nancy Doherty to New Jersey Poison Control. Okay, guys, so that is the case of Charlie Cullen, the Angel of Death. There was so much information on this case. I had to divide it into 2 parts. That was part 1. Part 2 is coming soon, and you do not want to miss it. It is juicy with a capital J. We will go in depth about the call that started Charlie's downfall, the unimaginably careless and self-serving actions of the hospitals, and we will see a nurse go undercover to finally catch and bring down the Angel of Death. And if you liked what you saw, and I hope you did, Give this video a like, give it a thumbs up, and subscribe to my channel for more deep dives on true crime, unsolved mysteries, and anything else wicked. My name is Jacqueline. Thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of the day.